Okay. Good morning. Thank you. My name is Paul Grogan. I'm the president of the Boston Foundation, and I'm delighted to welcome you here this morning. If I could have your attention, please. This is obviously a subject that is of more than casual interest in our community, and we're very glad to provide this opportunity to explore the issues around education deeply, as I think we will. This is a room full of education and philanthropic luminaries, so I'm not going to start introducing people, with two exceptions. One is we are enormously pleased, and she will be on the panel to follow, to welcome the president of the Boston City Council here today, Andrea Campbell. And I also want to recognize someone who has worked closely with the Boston Foundation for many years and made stellar contributions, our acting superintendent, Laura Priel, who will also be speaking later. Okay. I see a lot of familiar faces here, so I don't think I need to go on and on about the Boston Foundation. I will just say that we are a 100-year-old charity. We have philanthropic assets of about $1.2 billion, which enables the foundation and its donors to give away every year well over $100 million to large numbers of nonprofits engaged in a wide variety of critical work in our community. But in addition to the financial role, the stewardship and grant making that we do, today underscores another role we like to play at the Boston Foundation of bringing people together to define the challenges we face and hopefully to act on them. And as we will hear in this very interesting and provocative report, there's good news and bad news about the Boston Public Schools. I hope we can celebrate the good news and act on the bad news. That's what this is all about. We have a passionate belief that data is critical to having an informed, productive discussion, and so there will be plenty of that. But I do want to thank all of you for being here. Obviously, we continue to be on a quest with the Boston Public Schools to get even more good news flowing from it. I have a special treat this morning to kick this off, and that is our chair, Sandy Edgeley, who is here this morning. Many of you do not know her. She's very much behind the scenes. But she has been a critical player in philanthropy in this city generally and in the development of some of the really terrific nonprofit organizations in this city, like the Boys and Girls Clubs and many others. And she and her husband, Paul, are among the most generous and active philanthropists in our community. So please welcome Sandy Edgeley.
Thank you so much, Paul, for that very warm introduction, and welcome everyone to the Boston Foundation. Delighted to have such an incredible group here turned out for this very, very important topic. I'd also like to acknowledge two of my fellow board members who are here this morning, Paul Lee and Reverend Greg Groover. We have an extraordinary board of directors, and delighted to have the two of you here as well. As Paul mentioned, the support that the Boston Foundation receives for the Civic Leadership Fund allows us to have a real impact on issues that are critical to the civic health of Greater Boston. The fund supports the Foundation's research into key issues that inform and educate lawmakers and civic leaders. And I would argue that education is really first among those issues. I think since we have such a big turnout, we're all in agreement on that. Education is one of the Boston Foundation's 5 critical impact areas. These are the 5 priority areas where we invest our resources, our expertise, and our convening power, with a goal to really move the needle and have measurable impact in these areas. And I'd say in the area of education, Boston Public Schools and our students there are perhaps our most critical stakeholder. Boston Public Schools serve more than 55,000 students in 125 schools, the largest school district in Massachusetts. BPS is also one of the most diverse school districts in the nation. Nearly 1 in every 2 students speaks a language other than English at home. And our students come from 139 different countries. It's important that every student have the opportunity to achieve a quality public education and to be successful in their pursuit of post-secondary education. Although BPS has ranked consistently among the top-performing large public school districts in the country, we are facing significant challenges, including sizable achievement gaps that you're going to hear more about later from the presentation and the panel discussion. We are in a critical moment in time where we really thought that this report and this conversation matters. After many years of stable leadership, BPS has had 4 interim or permanent superintendents in the past 10 years and is currently searching for its 5th. This transition in leadership has given us the opportunity to pause and take stock of BPS's progress and to contemplate the most pressing issues impacting our students. It's really an opportune time to convene and to assess where have we been, where are we now, and where should we be heading. To help frame today's report and discussion, I would like to introduce Laura Perrill, named Interim Superintendent of BPS in 2018. Laura previously served as President and CEO of Edvestors. Since its launch in 2002, under her leadership, Edvestors has raised and helped investors direct more than $26 million in funds for urban school improvement, with a primary focus on the Boston Public Schools. Laura's nonprofit management career has focused on meeting the needs of children and families in Boston. Prior to Edvestors, Laura led the Perrill Consulting Group, working with local schools, nonprofits, and foundations. Please help me welcome Laura Perrill.
Thank you, Sandy, for that warm welcome. Good morning, everyone. I'm truly honored to be here. I want to thank as well Paul Grogan, Elizabeth Pauley, the entire team at the Boston Foundation, Bellwether Education Partners, and to Boston City Council President Andrea Campbell, and Boston School Committee Vice Chairperson Alexandra Davila, who will be here in a little bit, and to all of the thoughtful and incredibly knowledgeable panelists who you will all benefit, and we will all benefit from hearing from this morning. I'm looking forward to today's presentation about the report looking at Boston Public Schools over a 10-year period, because it's always important to take a big picture analysis of our work so that we can improve outcomes for our 55,000 students. There's always something to learn from a close review and comparison of national data, and there's always value to considering the qualitative feedback and recommendations in any snapshot of stakeholder interviews, both of which today's report provides. I've been along for this journey with the Boston Public Schools in various capacities. First, as a mother of 2 children who attended BPS from kindergarten through high school graduation. Then as the leader of a school improvement organization, Edvestors, and now as the interim superintendent of a district that cannot afford to mark time, even during transition. Through it all, I remain a fierce champion of public education as a force for good. In particular, I believe in the power and necessity of the Boston Public Schools serving as it does the largest number of this city's children and the greatest concentration of high-need students, to continue to push itself in collaboration with all of you and so many more, to ensure that BPS meets the needs of all of its learners. And on that note, I'm joined here today by so many of my colleagues who work every day on behalf of our 55,000 students. So I'd like to ask all of the Boston Public Schools staff in the audience today to please stand. And thank you for your work. What today's report tells us is that Boston is a leader in many ways, but we also have more to do, and in some cases, a very long way to go on behalf of our students. There is no room for complacency here. We do see important things happening in the Boston Public Schools each and every day. This includes continuing to advance our high school graduation rates, as the data do and will continue to show this year, as well as celebrating some of our most rapidly improving schools, including recently the Winship and Manning schools, which were 2 of just 52 schools statewide to receive the Commonwealth School of Recognition Award last fall, or the Winthrop School, which exited turnaround status in just 5 years after being so designated in 2013. And yes, we continue to be one of the top urban districts in the country, as today's summary of longitudinal data also shows us. However, there are major challenges that remain. And among our biggest and most persistent challenges are advancing academic rigor for all, while closing opportunity and achievement gaps for more of our students, which today's report also demonstrates. When I came into this role last July, I was blessed to have deep existing knowledge of district initiatives, thanks to many years of close work with Boston schools alongside many of you. I spent the first 5 weeks in closed-door listening sessions with more than half of our system's dedicated school leaders, anyone who was good enough to sit down with me in the dog days of July and August. I did the same with our central office departments in order to reset the relationship between central office and schools and to revitalize the central office leadership team. Those conversations with both school and central office leaders continue to inform much of our collective work, centered always on the needs of students and the families we serve. One of the things that became apparent from my new inside role was the desire and depth of commitment, both in schools and in central office, to advance equity for our students, even when that means taking on difficult conversations or changing the way things have been done. Since making tough choices to advance equity is one of the themes of today's report, I want to point to some of the ways that that is happening and must continue to expand in BPS. I'll start with Build BPS, our 10-year educational and facilities master plan, because equity is truly at the forefront of that work to reshape the educational landscape of Boston, and this work was relaunched in October of 2018. With 2/3 of our schools built before World War II, Build BPS uses thorough data and analyses that take into account what our biggest needs are, where our enrollment patterns are shifting, and where our most vulnerable students are located, so that our schools can adjust to match those needs, all with a strong emphasis on expanding access to high-quality programming for more students. Through Build BPS, Boston has an opportunity to expand programming, make major renovations in school buildings, or build new schools in areas of the city where we know there is historic lack of access. Also through Build BPS, we're attempting to reduce the number of times students transition between schools, which we know is another hurdle for students and families. That's why we're moving toward a narrower range of grade configurations focused on 2 primary models to better meet citywide student needs. Families will be able to choose from a set of schools that serve grades K-6 and 7-12, and others that serve and preserve our strong K-8s and 9-12s. Another core and very important equity theme embedded in the Build BPS framework is setting a new priority for equity of program placement for our most vulnerable learners, our students with special needs and our English learners. Right now, far too many of these students are concentrated in a small number of schools. Among Boston's 33 high schools today, 56% of our highest need students with disabilities are concentrated in just 5 of our most struggling open enrollment high schools. And of these 5, 3 of them also serve the highest concentration of English learners. Historically, these decisions about program placement were based on where space was available. This does not provide equitable choice for our most vulnerable learners and their families, and it concentrates complicated student needs in our most struggling schools. With Build BPS, and indeed with all program placement decisions moving forward. We have the opportunity to be proactive in keeping these student populations at the forefront of our planning and policy decisions rather than as an afterthought. Another example of using an equity lens to drive decisions is our ongoing work to remove barriers to our exam schools. As I announced in October, beginning in fall 2019, all 6th grade students will now be able to take the exam school entrance test in their schools, in their classrooms during the regular school day, instead of having to travel to an off-site location on a random Saturday in November. For many of our students from historically marginalized populations, those whose families speak a different language at home or who are unfamiliar with the BPS exam school selection process, this will make our exam schools more accessible. It is a step, but an important step. This is in addition to our work to expand the number of seats in our exam school prep program, the Exam School Initiative, for traditionally underserved students as well. It's important to note, however, that we can't just focus on the exam schools. We actually have 4 types of high schools in Boston: open enrollment high schools, exam schools, alternative education schools, and selective admission high schools, like Boston Arts Academy, Fenway High School, New Mission, and many others of our terrific high schools. We also need to start looking at ways to reduce barriers to all of these types of schools as well. This will at times involve difficult conversations, but it is work that we must do to ensure that our diverse school models collectively work to meet the citywide needs of our children. There's much more work to be done at the high school level in particular, and this will be a key focus of collaborative school and central office effort over the coming months as we prepare for the next school year. Another equity-minded approach from central office is our system of academic support for our highest needs schools. Beginning last spring and continuing over the summer, BPS embarked on a reorganization of our schools and central office support, dividing the highest needs schools into smaller networks where principals collaborate with one another to enhance best practices and school supports, along with coaching from a BPS academic superintendent. We believe this strategy is going in the right direction, and it's empowering our school leaders to make decisions that lead to effective outcomes. The new system of differentiated support for schools through these school support networks also ensures that schools that are struggling get deeper and more intensive assistance from central office teams to assist their improvement efforts. On the human capital side, we are continuing with our successful early hiring initiative, which is now in its 5th year and has led to substantial positive outcomes for our students in the form of the staff that surround them. It gives all schools the flexibility to hire effective teachers from a diverse pool of candidates early in the hiring process based on mutual consent and best fit for the school communities. These candidates also tend to better reflect the demographics of the students we serve. We know that when students see teachers who reflect their identities and cultures, they are more likely to succeed. According to a 2017 Johns Hopkins University study, the dropout rate for Black students is reduced by 29% if they have at least one Black teacher in grades 3 through 5. Because we know that most teachers take their first jobs in their home states, BPS has done tremendous work over the past few years to develop homegrown teacher pipeline programs for local residents who want to become teachers, from our own current paraprofessionals to community members to BPS graduates. And more than 50% of these program graduates are educators of color. So we are building our own pipeline where they don't come to us as frequently through traditional teacher preparation programs. When it comes to our early hiring initiative, I'm happy to report that last year we had our most successful early hiring season on record, including more than 51% of early hires identifying as educators of color. BPS employs nearly 50% of all Black educators in the state, along with 25% of the state's Asian educators and 25% of our Latinx educators. Despite these efforts, our teacher demographics still do not reflect the demographics of our students, so we know we must continue to work at this goal. Finally, I want to highlight how equity factors into our budgeting process. Over the past several years, BPS has become increasingly sophisticated in how it applies an equity lens to our budget process. I also want to take this opportunity to thank Mayor Walsh and his team for holding strong to their commitment of supporting BPS through our annual budgeting process. Since taking office, the Walsh administration has consistently filled the gap left by dramatic decreases in state funding for the Boston Public Schools. This, too, is an equity issue. In 2010, state aid made up 20% of the BPS budget, and next year that will fall to 4%. I am joining the mayor and other city and state leaders in supporting the Education Promise Act, which would benefit not only Boston, but a number of other cities and towns in Massachusetts. If this bill passes, we believe state funding to BPS would increase responsibly and equitably, recognizing the high needs base of our student population while also supporting more districts statewide. Despite these declines in state funding for the Boston Public Schools, with strong support from the city, our city allocation to the Boston Public Schools has increased by $200 million since Mayor Walsh took office 6 years ago. In our proposed FY20 budget for the coming year, we're making new investments in targeted supports for students who are off track to graduate, in science instruction, and in family engagement, all earmarked in the FY20 budget. We're doubling down on investments that we know are providing strong outcomes, such as early childhood education, supports for homeless students, and extended time in the school day. We are also this year investing in greater budget sustainability and predictability by increasing funding for soft landings or additional school allocations that protect schools from the swings of the budget or enrollment due to Boston's approach to weighted student funding. While WSF is an important equity tool as well, in that dollars flow to schools based on the individualized education needs of students, WSF also means that schools are vulnerable to small shifts in enrollment, so the investment in soft landings helps to buffer this for more school communities. We are also now in the second year of using a tool called the Opportunity Index to further refine how we allocate certain district funds based on student and school community need. We are also beginning to use the Opportunity Index in programming decisions, such as the exciting rollout of the My Way Cafe Food and Nutrition Program, a public-private partnership between the Shaw Foundation, I believe Jill Shaw is with us today, the City of Boston, and the Boston Public Schools. The neighborhood rollout across the city over several years is being prioritized using the Opportunity Index to identify the highest need students. As a result, we began with East Boston, Roxbury, and Mattapan, followed by another group of schools in Dorchester in the coming year. I cite all of these things because it's important for you all to get a sense of the work that needs to happen every single day and to consider today's report in light of this complicated landscape. All of you here are stakeholders and have a vested interest in the students of the Boston Public Schools being successful. As a city and as a region, we all care about this, and I'm grateful to you all for being here this morning. I'd like again to thank Bellwether and the Boston Foundation for taking an in-depth look at these important issues, and I'm truly looking forward to hearing the ideas that will be shared on the panel in just a few moments. Thank you all very much.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Pauley, and I'm delighted to add my voice of welcome. I'll just be here for a moment because I want to thank Laura for all she's doing and for agreeing to serve in this capacity as our interim superintendent. So thank you very much, and thank you for being here today. It's now my pleasure to introduce Bonnie O'Keefe, who is one of the authors of the report that we're momentarily going to be sharing with you. Bonnie is an associate partner at the Bellwether Education Partners Policy and Evaluation Team. Since 2016, Bonnie has worked on a wide range of issues, including state education policy, accountability systems, and early childhood education. Prior to joining Bellwether, Bonnie worked in assessment and accountability for the Washington, D.C. Office of the State Superintendent of Education, and she also worked at D.C. Action for Children, a nonprofit focused on child education and health advocacy. Bonnie is joined today by Melissa Steele King, who is one of the co-authors and here today and will be available for questions after the presentation. So with no more from me, Bonnie, please join us.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you, Elizabeth, for the kind introduction. Thank you, Superintendent Perrell, so much for your remarks. And thank you to the Boston Foundation for gathering all of you together and for supporting this work. We are really thrilled that this report has already generated such interest, and we're looking forward to more people reading it and joining the conversation. My name is Bonnie O'Keefe, and I'm an associate partner with Bellwether Education Partners. Bellwether is a national nonprofit with a mission to dramatically change education and life outcomes for underserved students. And we do this by helping education organizations accelerate their impact and by working to improve policy and practice. My co-authors, Melissa Steele King is here today from our policy and evaluation team. Our third co-author, Chad Aldeman, unfortunately could not be here today. So this project began when the Boston Foundation asked us to take a look at the Boston Public Schools' progress and performance over time and benchmark it against other cities. Shortly after we began this work, it became clear that Boston would be looking for a new permanent superintendent, making this a particularly timely moment to reflect back on the past decade and think about how that might impact the future. I will say that although the title of this report says 2007 to 2017, we took a bit of a looser definition of a decade. We pulled in more recent data where it was available and reached a little farther back where it seemed important to do so. Our key research questions in this report were: how has BPS progressed in the past decade across a variety of outcomes for students? How does that progress and performance compare against other urban districts? What policies or practices may have contributed to that performance? And finally, what can local leaders and stakeholders take away from these results? We tackled these questions through three different types of information. First, we looked at a variety of data, national assessment data from the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or the NAEP, as well as the Stanford Educational Data Archive, which allows for more detailed city-to-city comparisons. We looked to local and state data, such as the MCAS, enrollment trends, college readiness metrics, pre-K access, and graduation rates. Then we looked to research and documents that had already been released, including things like the Build BPS plan, the BPS strategic plan, and other evaluative reports that have been released over recent years, as well as recent prior research on BPS's outcomes. For example, the recent EY Parthenon report on at-risk youth and the Boston Area Research Initiative study of BPS school choice policies. Finally, to provide greater context on all this data, we interviewed a selection of stakeholders who represented an array of roles and viewpoints with regards to BPS. It's important to say that this report cannot draw any causal relationships between the policy changes we describe and the outcomes we analyze, but our goal was to draw together some of these disparate threads of data and types of outcomes and wider context together into one place to provide a foundation point and a fuller picture of what's been going on. And now I'll move on to some of the key findings from our report. First, we found across many metrics of educational access and opportunity that BPS has improved in the past 10 years. In this graph, you'll see BPS's graduation rate in red, climbing at a faster rate than the state as a whole, shown in blue, and closing the gap with state averages. In other important metrics, such as AP access and pre-K access, we also see improvement over the past 10 years. Then next, looking comparatively, taking kind of a national lens, we see, compared to other urban districts in metrics such as graduation and NAEP results, Boston generally does better than the average large city and near or below the national average. And what you'll see in this graph is 8th grade math scores from 2003 to 2017. BPS compared to an average of large cities across the country and the national public average. So BPS has climbed above the large city average and met or just below the national public average in 8th grade math, which I'll return to in a moment. We wanted to dive a little bit deeper than those averages and take a look at achievement gaps in BPS and see how they might compare in size to some other cities with similar size and somewhat similar demographics. We chose New Orleans and DC public schools for those two main reasons: similar size, roughly similar demographics. These school districts were, of course, also known for making big reforms over the past 10 years, and so we thought they might make an interesting comparison for that reason as well. And here you see Boston in red. In terms of 3rd grade reading and 8th grade math, in the white-black achievement gap and white-Latino gap, Boston's gap is smaller than these other two cities. We also found or saw in other research that Boston is in the 70th percentile nationwide of districts in terms of annual student growth. So that's an important metric when we're thinking about how Boston might eventually close those achievement gaps. How fast are students growing, no matter where they start off? Despite all this, while all these things are to be commended, BPS's strengths do not necessarily serve all students equally. Here, I'm returning once again to Boston's 8th grade NAEP math scores, this time broken out by race and ethnicity. Not only are there large gaps, these gaps have actually gotten larger, especially in the past 5 years for Black and Latino students. Together, Black and Latino students make up over 70% of Boston Public Schools students, and there is no path to continued excellence and continued above-average performance for the district that does not include these students. Now we're turning to MCAS scores. So we've gone from national to state and from math to reading. This is a selection of MCAS performance groups for this past year in grades 3 through 8. And now, in addition to having the racial and ethnic subgroups, we've also included English learners, economically disadvantaged students, and special education students. And one thing that really jumps out at us from this data, not only are these students underperforming the BPS average, you'll see in the bottom bar, SGP, Student Growth Percentile, is a metric that the state uses to track how students do and progress each year relative to their peers. What we would want to see is for the lowest performing student groups to have a higher level of growth, which would tell us that they were eventually on a path to meeting up with their peers. Instead, what we see is that the most disadvantaged groups also have the lowest growth. So we're going to transition here into talking a little bit about what we found about the context of what was going on over the same period in BPS. First, we want to note several key challenges taking place in the district over this same time period. In terms of enrollment, BPS's enrollment has fallen by about 3,700 students since 2007. This enrollment drop affects some schools and neighborhoods more than other, creating budget instability, which Superintendent Peril was just explaining and remarking upon. In terms of facilities, many BPS facilities are aging and in need of significant repair or modernization. Some are under-enrolled and others are over-enrolled. Segregation, which has been a decades-long struggle for BPS. There's a long history of both segregation and integration efforts in BPS. By some metrics, racial, ethnic, and economic segregation in the system has gotten worse instead of better. And finally, interviewees perceive low community trust in BPS and a sense of a lack of clear strategy, which has likely been exacerbated over a number of leadership changes over the past 10 years. We do want to note and commend some bright spots that came up over and over again in both interviews and in our research into BPS. These initiatives stood out, and the first I want to note is improvements in teacher hiring practices, which look radically different today than they did just a few years ago. They include accelerated hiring timelines, mutual consent between principals and teachers, and reduced weight of seniority in hiring. I also want to note that BPS and Boston as a whole is nationally noted for its investment in early childhood education. Pre-K access and quality have both been progressing, and BPS in particular has been recognized for its attention to instructional quality and curricula in pre-K. And while there is doubtless still work to be done in this area to ensure that high-quality pre-K classrooms are available wherever children need them, I think that there's been a lot of progress made over the past decade. And third, we want to note the strength of some of the external partnerships that BPS has built and the ways in which these partnerships have expanded the district's capacity and brought new opportunities to students. And for example, we could look to the BPS Arts expansion, Success Boston, and the Lynch Leadership Academy principal trainings. However, some of these wins were overshadowed by controversies or dropped initiatives, which have created some skepticism around improvement. For example, the effort to shift school start times in response to transportation costs and research on student sleep experienced significant pushback and was eventually dropped. Movement towards a unified enrollment system with the charter sector is on hold, and BPS's stance towards school autonomy versus district-led change within its own schools, the degree to which principals do or do not have control over certain decisions, has seemed to change over time or apply inconsistently to some schools versus others. And generally, interviewees worried that even initiatives they were supportive of or felt very optimistic about might fall through the cracks. So BPS's challenges are not necessarily unique in comparison to other urban districts. There are many cities that have struggled with leadership turnover, with high achievement gaps, with older facilities, budget instability. I think one of the things that is most unique about Boston, however, is that its chief challenge is not in the overall performance of its system, but in the inequitable distribution of outcomes within it. I think, as Superintendent Pearl was saying about not having complacency towards the fact that Boston does perform well compared to so many other urban districts, but also acknowledging that there's still a long way to go, especially for the most underserved students. And it was in some ways difficult for us in our research and the people we interviewed to say what Boston's vision for improving those outcomes has been and where dramatic change will come from next. We felt that with the scope of this report and our role as researchers, we did not aim to give any prescriptive policy solutions. It's important, in order for change to be durable and successful, that vision and drive come from within the community. And we want this data and this report to really inform that conversation. However, we do offer 3 recommendations aimed primarily at BPS's next superintendent, as well as all the folks in this room. First, to articulate a clear theory of action and drive it through implementation. At times, it seemed that Boston has been doing a lot in a lot of areas, but it wasn't always clear how all that action will come together as a whole. Make tough choices to advance equity. As I highlighted earlier, the students who are persistently underperforming make up the vast majority of BPS students. These students need solutions and likely more resources and supports, and the new superintendent cannot act alone in order to create big change for them. They will need the support of community leaders, of the mayor, of the school committee, and others in order to galvanize energy to make big changes. And finally, we encourage BPS to double down on areas of strength. Bright spots like early childhood, upward growth in graduation rates, strong partnerships, and some of the work that we've already noted are assets upon which BPS can build the foundation of its next era of excellence and equity. And I greatly look forward to hearing what the panel has to say about the report. Thank you all.
Well, hello again. I'm Elizabeth Pauley, and it's my pleasure now to invite the panel to join me. I'm not going to tell you too many things about this all-star panel, except I will say it probably will be the best panel we've ever had here at the Boston Foundation. Their full bios and many accomplishments are listed on the back of your agenda, but I'll just go right down the row and just tell you a little bit about each of them. Right next to me is City Council President Andrea Campbell, President of the Boston City Council. She was first elected as District 4 Boston City Councilor in 2015, representing Dorchester and Mattapan, as well as parts of Rosendale and Jamaica Plain. She is also a Boston Public Schools graduate. Next to Andrea is Amanda Fernandez, a social entrepreneur and CEO and co-founder of Latinos for Education, the first Latino-founded and led national organization solely dedicated to creating leadership pathways for emerging Latino education leaders and diversifying education nonprofit boards. Amanda is also a member of the Massachusetts Board of Elementary and Secondary Education and a trustee at Roxbury Community College. Next to Amanda is Megan Irons, a Boston Globe reporter who covers social justice and race issues. She's been at the Globe for more than 16 years, and her focus has been primarily around highlighting equity, inequality, and cultural issues. And most recently, she was one of the authors of the Valedictorian series, and she is also a BPS grad. Next to Megan is Alexandra Oliver Davila, the Executive Director of Sociedad Latina, a role she has been in since 1999. She also serves as the Vice Chair of the Boston Public School Committee and is the co-chair of the search committee for the next Boston Public School Superintendent. And finally, we have Tanisha Sullivan, who is the president of the NAACP Boston branch. She is very active in our community in numerous ways, including serving on the boards of nonprofit organizations committed to educational and economic development of diverse communities, including the Girl Scouts of Eastern Massachusetts and WGBH. So please join me in welcoming this rockstar panel. So first, I think we just heard a lot of powerful information from Bonnie. You've all had a chance to look at the report, so I'd like to just invite your general reactions about the presentation and the report, what resonated with you, any surprises, and Andrea, we'll start with you.
First of all, thank you for having me, and thank you to the Boston Foundation and all of you for being here this early in the morning. So I'm just going to be candid on this panel today. I was depressed, I was angry, I was frustrated, I felt a lot of emotions, but then I said, okay, well, what are we going to do about it? And so I want to first acknowledge, I appreciate the work of the superintendent as well as the incredible staff that is here represented from central office today, and I think they all go into these buildings to do really difficult work, so I want to acknowledge that first, and my frustration isn't directed at them. It's directed at a system, right? And so in reviewing the report, I'm a product of Boston Public Schools. I went to 5 of them, including Boston Latin School. My father, who was born in Roxbury in 1933, was a product of BPS schools. All of them were excellent at the time, so we know what is possible, what is what's achievable. So the question is, what are we going to do about it? And one thing I loved about the report, I don't need new reports, frankly, to talk about the achievement gap. I'm also an attorney. I used to do education law. I saw those gaps for a really long time. They persist. I don't need more reports to talk about whether or not we are preparing our students to graduate from high school to do well in the careers that they choose for themselves. We have to do better on all those data points. But one thing I loved about the report that it called out is political will. And I think I'm on this panel to talk about that. We need political will, leadership, and vision to get all of this done. We are making some tough decisions, whether it's stuff related to or issues of exam schools and access and accessibility, whether it's making sure that we have universal pre-K. You know, not just for 4-year-olds, 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, everyone having a quality seat at BPS. Whether it's closing the achievement gaps, doing more to make sure that our teacher population reflects the students they serve. All of this requires political will. And the question is, are we going to exercise the political will that is necessary so that we won't be back here in a year, 2 years, 5 years, reviewing another report that tells us similar things, or sadly, demonstrates that Boston, a leader in education, is falling behind with respect to other urban districts in this country. Boston is a leader. It can continue to lead. It can continue to be great. And I'll end on this because I know I want to get to these incredible ladies that I sit next to who do the work day in and day out. I am a Princeton University graduate, a UCLA law graduate, but for my education in BPS, I grew up poor in the city of Boston. I wouldn't be sitting here. I take pride in that. And so the question is, what are we going to do about it? And I hope this panel really gets to that, and I'm in. I'm all in.
Thank you. Amanda.
Thank you and good morning. First off, let's just take a minute to look at this panel. A diverse group of women. And you'll hear me today talk about why this panel and what we look like and what we represent is really what will make a difference. I agree that more reports are helpful to highlight and to frankly not let us forget, right? Because sometimes we can forget. And so I think these reports help to highlight the need that we continually have, not only in Boston or the state or the country, because these data points are consistent with what we see across the country in many ways. So what struck me was that there are bright spots, and once again, I concur that the data in here is not about the work that BPS is doing or not doing, because I do believe that what will be required takes much more than those who are doing the day-to-day work, and I salute those who do the day-to-day work in all of our schools. Sitting on the State Board of Education, I have the opportunity to see that different perspective, and I see what the requirements are, what the expectations are. And so we need to look at that, but at the same time, hold ourselves accountable to how we will continue to make improvements for students, in particular, our most vulnerable students. So I will say in my final words, but you'll hear me talking a lot about this, is that I believe the source of some of the answers have to do with who is leading our schools, who's leading our policies, and making sure that those are diverse folks that do that. And I believe that a significant focus on English language learners, which has been touched upon, is where we have to double down efforts.
Hello, and thank you for having me as well. The two things that struck out with me were the fact that Boston has been a leader, and because school districts in New Orleans and DC, which had been struggling and underperforming, are now catching up to the city, and that's very troubling. And the other thing that stuck out with me was the lack of a unified vision for the city. It made me think of my own high school upbringing. I went to the Burke High School many years ago. And at the time I went, the Burke had lost its accreditation. It was being transformed and being turned around. Al Holland was my high school principal at the time. There was a lot of work from the district and from the community to really transform the Burke High School, and he did within 4 years. I think most of our graduating class graduated, and we all went on, and here I am writing stories about BPS and equity issues around the city. But after the Burke High School turned itself around, the district then focused its resources on other schools in other areas, and the Burke went right back to where it was. And so I wasn't surprised by the findings, and I wasn't surprised by what was revealed here today. And it did make me sad that many years since I've graduated from high school, we're still discussing the same thing. I spent most of last year reporting on the top students who graduated from BPS last year. And the data from that was just pretty startling. You know, about a quarter of them finished college within 6 years. So yes, we can all say that, you know, there are bright spots and there are things that we ought to do. Everyone in here and every person that I've met in my coverage across the city wants BPS to do well. They want the students to succeed. We just haven't agreed on how to make it work. And so I'm glad we're here. I'm glad we're discussing this. And I look forward to having more to say on this as we go on.
Thank you.
Great. Good morning. Thank you for having me here, and no pressure that it's the best panel you ever had. So I'm battling myself internally because, you know, I lead a community-based organization and I'm also a school committee, so I get to see both sides. And I think for me, what resonates the most as a person that leads a youth development organization is the achievement gaps. And even though we have closed some of the gaps, it's still alarming, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done. On the same token, I think one of the things that I feel the report I would have liked to seen a little bit more focus, and it was mentioned very briefly, but is it's so focused on BPS. And BPS cannot do this alone. We need to have everybody on board. That means that when we're talking about jobs for students, we need to have businesses that line up and take those graduates. And that goes to the other question when we get to later about the valedictorian story is, it's a larger picture. We need colleges, higher education institutions to also step up to the plate. We need everybody to own this. Because, you know, we cannot continue to do things just the way that we've done them. So BPS can't do it alone, and I feel that the report's very, very focused on BPS. I get that, but I still feel like I would have liked to have a little bit more expansion on that. The other piece I think that I would have liked to see more focus as well in the report is that we have to also look at our funding. We are a dependent district, and I think that we do not highlight that enough. We are being faced with some drastic cuts that go beyond anything that you cannot ask a teacher to do 7 jobs, and there are some hard choices that we have to make. So when I hear about the political will, although I agree, it's also the community will. We have to be open, and we need to understand that there are going to be tough choices and changes, and we have to be able to compromise. So I think those are the things that kind of resonated with me that I'll be talking about later on throughout the panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Denise.
Great. Well, I mean, I have so much to say. This is fantastic. I'm going to keep it short at this moment, but I too want to just acknowledge the Boston Foundation. Where's Paul? I know he's back there in the back. For this opportunity to talk about this very important issue. And of course, this is the best panel I've ever been on. And I'm certainly looking forward to the conversation. Look, this is not the first report that any of us in this room have read on education, specifically education as it relates to Boston Public Schools. It's not the first report to share the data that we've all seen on the screen and that some of us have had the opportunity to already to read. It's not the first report to share for us to amplify once again the pervasive racial, ethnic, language, class, ability, achievement gaps that exist in our system. It's not the first to call out also the challenges as it relates to community engagement and how community kind of plays into all of this. It's not the first. I'm hoping at some point it'll be the last, right? So how do we get there? I do believe that there are bright spots in the system. There are some things that we've been able to do well. Some of them have worked out and some of them haven't. I'm one who believes that when you take the leap and you are innovative and you are bold, that sometimes it means things work out and sometimes it means things don't. I don't agree with all of the bright spots that were called out here. I don't believe that they're all bright spots in terms of being successful and leading to the types of student outcomes that we want to see. But I do want to acknowledge that they're bright spots in the sense that we were willing to take the leap. And so what I want to talk about is not so much the what, because I think we all know the what, but how we're going to get there. I do believe that it is critically important for us as a collective, not just a superintendent, not just a district, but as a collective to have bold vision as it relates to public education in this city. So what is that going to take? It's going to take, I believe, a willingness to really push the limits on innovation. I believe it's going to take us really changing how we think about inclusion and to be radically inclusive in how we go about this work. Right? Thinking about how paternalistic we've been up to this point, dictating what the reforms are going to be, rather than bringing more people, more stakeholders into the conversation through the process. And I also think it's going to require us to be agile. And oftentimes when people talk about vision, they talk about being focused, staying the course. Vision also requires a level of agility that allows us to recognize when things aren't working, that allows us to recognize when we need to go bigger, when we need to go bolder, when we need to perhaps change course. That's something that we haven't been willing to do in an open way as a collective. So I really do want to take the opportunity today to talk more about the how, talking about the who is involved in this, and to figure out how we are going to get ultimately to the point where, you know, all of our children truly are succeeding, regardless of what zip code, regardless of what race, regardless of what native language, but they are all succeeding.
Well, thank you all. I'd like to pick up on that theme of the how. So this isn't the first report, as folks have mentioned, that have raised the issue of equity. I was struck when Bonnie said in her presentation that some of the lowest performing groups are making the slowest progress or growth. And so let's talk about equity. How do we address that? How do we make sure that we are changing the way, as the report says, changing the way Boston provides educational services to its most disadvantaged students? Where do we start? Amanda? Softball question.
Well, I'll solve it in my response. So equity is a term that's being used a lot in a lot of contexts. Everything is being done with equity at the center. So one thing I want to caution is the use of that terminology and what we really mean by it, and how does it relate to the many priorities and actions that a school district might take. When I think about equity, though, and what I think about when it's equity at the center, it is on two dimensions. One is, once again, who we are engaging in thinking about the changes that are required and/or the ways in which we need to keep iterating on things that might be promising. So what that means is a hyper-focus on the representation of leaders and teachers of color, those who are closest to our students. And when I look at the imbalance in Boston Public Schools of 80% or so students of color and the balance of teachers and leaders who are on the opposite side of those statistics, I think it's really important that we think about equity from that perspective. Our teachers need to be more diverse, as Superintendent Perrill identified the Johns Hopkins research. The research is out. And that's a good thing because it now proves that this isn't a soft endeavor. It really is critical to ensure that our students of color see themselves in their teachers and in the leadership. Everything from culturally responsive and linguistic practices will be improved, better relations, role models. Role models really do matter. And once again, that is not soft to me. So that's first and foremost, and that is the work that we do at Latinos for Education. That's what we're focused on. But in addition to that, I was really struck by where we're at with English learners. And the fact that 1 in 3 English learners in Boston Public School, 1 in 3 students are English learners in Boston Public Schools, and then I heard 1 in 2 have English that is not their primary language in the home. So when I think about the efforts that we've made, and frankly a rollback that we made in English learner supports over the years, we're trying to reintroduce supports at the state level with the Look Act. But I will on record say that I think it's insufficient what is being offered through the Look Act and the types of support. So when I think about funding and where funding should go, I would see English learners as a critical area where we need to provide much better supports.
Okay, you want me to jump in?
I do, partly because I want to pick up on something that you said that's, I think, is related to equity, which is the turnaround at the Burke, then the downturn
Yeah.
at the Burke. Can you connect those two?
Yeah, I'll do my best. I did want to talk about vision. And I think, and I said this in when I spoke earlier, was that everyone is very passionate about education. Everyone wants to see the students succeed, the teachers go to work, really wanting to help their students. Students want to learn. We all want to do it, but we're not all on the same page. The mayor is not on the same page sometimes with the school district in our coverage. I just want to try to keep my opinions too much to myself. The parents aren't always on the same page with the district. The district isn't always communicating in a way that the parents are getting it. There is complete discord. If you are covering education in a way that I sometimes do, and you talk to people from different parts of the city, everyone is passionate about this issue and wanted to see people succeed, but they're talking loudly and they're talking past each other. And I think without having a clear vision, without everyone being on the same page, you are articulating, your communication is lost. It's the first thing I learned in journalism. No matter how good your plan is or how good your idea is, if you cannot convey that to the masses and get them on your side, communications is lost. So I think the first thing is, can we get everybody on the same page about a few really good ideas? There are plenty of ideas, plenty of studies, plenty of plans, but we've actually stalled. So can we all get each other on the same page? I think there definitely is a problem, just getting back to the question that you asked, about where do we put our resources. And I think I think the practice has always been, what is our measure of success? Okay, we did turn the Burke around. The Burke is great. Let's just put our resources somewhere else. And the Burke is left to sort of fend for itself and eventually went back to the same place. That's because I'll get back to the lack of visioning and resources and that sort of thing. I think for BPS to turn the corner, and I think there are a lot of good things going on. You talked about Success Boston and a lot of partnerships that could work better. The first thing that needs to happen is we all need to get on the same page about what we want from the district, what is reasonable and rational, what can be done, and how we can all get there.
I just want to add on the equity piece. I'm the first Black woman to serve as council president, and that's a huge responsibility. And I always sit with that with incredible pride, but it's a huge responsibility. And so one of the things I said before I leave this position is I was going to bring the council through a racial equity training, and I fought and fought to get foundations, including this one, to fund that training. And why is that? What is equity? In this room, there are people who probably don't know what we mean by equity, the difference between equity and equality, which is a problem. Mm-hmm. If you're serving this population, if you're looking at these reports that have distinctions and disparities built around race, you need to know something about race. You need to know something about the history of this country, the history of our Constitution, the history of the city of Boston, the city that we love, the history of busing. All of that we need to know in order to be equipped with the tools in order to be effective in this. And to start, I said, well, one thing I can do is at least bring this council through a training so that we're all equipped, including my 7 awesome white male colleagues, that they are equipped as well to do this work. Everyone needs to be a part of it. And so I agree that we need to probably come up with a new term, throw equity out the window and just say, hey, we need to talk about race, we need to talk about history, we need to have a shared language and understanding so that we can then tackle these issues together and all be on the same page. That is one concrete thing that everyone in this room could do. They could go back to their institutions, they could go into their homes and say, I'm committed to making sure that people know this history of the city of Boston. I'm committed that people know the history of race. How do you define race? How do you define racism? How do you define any ism? And if you don't have a common understanding or foundation of all of those things, you will not be effective in education or all the other issues that we have to solve on a parallel track in order to make sure that our students of color and that our residents of color and those most vulnerable, including our Asian residents as well, who often are sort of put off over here, they too are people of color. And if you know your history, they too were marginalized in many ways, and that gets lost in many of these reports, including this one a little bit. We need to pull that apart. But that's one concrete thing that we can do to have that shared understanding. And once you have that sort of light bulb go off in your head, you go, oh, wait a minute. This system of racism and race and all that is affecting all of us. If it doesn't work for a few, it doesn't work for all of us. And someone said to me recently, when I was at a undoing racism workshop at the Fed. They're doing the work, which is great. But someone said, you know, we might need to throw white privilege out the window and talk about white oppression, because the system of racism also affects white people in a negative way. But you may not even know it. And I think that's, if we sort of come with that lens of that we're all in this together and work as a collective and create a space for that and throw away these sort of terms that are just sort of overused, I think we can move forward. And so the next conversation, at least that we come to as a group, we have a shared understanding of what we're all talking about. And we're starting at the same point, which is equity in the first place.
So I appreciate, yes, because now I don't have to say it. Thank you for clearing the space. So yes, yes, and yes, right? A couple of things as it relates to how we get to the point where our public school system is serving all students. I think that there are some short-term things, some kind of immediate things that we could be doing, and obviously there are long-term. And by long-term for me, I'm talking like maybe 3 years, because long-term means that we've got generations of kids that still aren't being served. So long-term is not long, right? So I do think part of the work is acknowledging where we have policies in place, practices in place today that are disproportionately impacting specifically Black and brown students. And I'm going to sit there, Counselor, only because Black and brown students are the students who the system is consistently failing from a performance standpoint. Certainly not trying to disregard that of color is much broader than that. But and acknowledging where we are currently supporting policies and practices that are not serving those students well. Some of them were called out in the report, right? Whether we're looking at exam schools, right? And what we do know, let me say this is a bright spot. What we do know in Boston is how to educate, right? People, like we're really good at that, right? But for some reason, we choose to educate some and not all. And so when we have a system like the exam schools, or we have a system like advanced work class, or we have, you know, certainly we recognize that AP is nationally offered to students, but AP is also a track, right? When we recognize that we support systems that year over year separate children in a way that allows us on some level to predict who's going to be successful in this city and who's not, we've got to be willing to stop playing around the edges and really delve in there and disrupt those systems, right? And so when we talk about, and so what we can do right now, I really do appreciate, we started about 18 months ago, we, the NAACP, along with the Lawyers for Civil Rights and a few other organizations, started talking very deeply about exam schools, right? And issued a white paper on exam schools and have traveled across this city, neighborhood to neighborhood, because this is, I agree, this is not just about Black people and brown people, it's about all of us. Neighborhood to neighborhood, talking about exam school access and opportunity and really seeking solutions for how we can make it more equitable. And what we do appreciate is that certainly the district has done some things to address the vast inequity that exists with respect to exam school access and opportunity, but we haven't done enough. What we know is that the system is inequitable. What we know is that the tests that we use for access to exam schools disproportionate, has an adverse effect on our children. And when I say our children, I mean kids who are in BPS, okay? We know that today. And yet we haven't been willing to disrupt that system and change how we provide access to young people. We're still playing the edges. We could change that tomorrow. We haven't been willing to delve into advanced work class in a way that is disruptive, in a way that says, you know what, we know how to educate our kids. We know what a rigorous curriculum looks like. We know what quality education looks like. Let's give it to all. Let me tell you what happened when we started talking about giving it to all. We got political pushback. Okay? Like in political pushback that went to the mayor's office, political pushback that went to the superintendent's office, Dr. Chang, political pushback from community, from our neighbors. So I agree, this isn't just about the system. It isn't just about the mayor's office. It's about, like, we need to check ourselves in the room, right? And so I do think that there are things that we could be doing today that could signal goodwill, that could signal that we're willing to work on some of these issues together, that could help to rebuild trust. But it's going to be up to all of us to buy into that. Long term, we need to disrupt the system. And that means talking about charter schools. That means talking about unions. That means talking about how families are involved in all of this, all of the third rail stuff that no one really wants to talk about.
So I want to talk about just about everything that you pitched.
That's
Yeah.
At 4 o'clock.
We'll have you out by 4. So there are so many things that we could talk about just in your comments alone, Tanisha, never mind everything that we've heard. I want to pick up on 2 threads, and because, Alex, this is something that you brought into the conversation. The report talks about families and communities not feeling engaged in key reform initiatives. And Tanisha, you talked about we all have to check ourselves and where we are and talk about the things that aren't working now and need to be disrupted long term. So how do we think about more successful engagement of families and community in this conversation? And Alex, do you want to start us off? I see a lot of head nodding.
Sure. I think we all agree to that, and I would say the interim superintendent also agrees, and so does the staff. I don't think anybody would disagree that we can do better in that realm, and we must do better. The things I'll say are, since the interim superintendent has started, she has done a lot of traveling all over various communities, talking to anyone who would like to speak with her, and also has really taken on the road the Build BPS pieces and brought it to a community level and has gone to all of those. And I think that's a shift that we need to see. So I think we need to look at family and community engagement in a much different way than what we've been doing, which is the traditional, we have a meeting here at this time that might not be convenient for you, and you might have to travel, and you either are going to be here and lend your voice or you're not. So I think there's a different way. We have just elevated Monica Roberts' position to be Chief Engagement Officer and added some more. Yes, she's here. And really focusing on, we've added more staff and really focusing on how we can be have better customer service, for lack of a better terminology. But I think it's a new day, it's a new opportunity. And again, I'm not saying we can't do better, because I think that we can, but I think there's new ways. We've seen in other districts, family engagement looks very different. Right now, I think our mindset is sometimes, unfortunately, when we are working with families, it is about the negatives and not about the assets. And I think it's an opportunity for us, with a new superintendent, having a new vision, that we really can change that, and that we can work with families from an asset-based approach, which I think the district has begun their work when we talk about CLSP, the Culturally Linguistic and Sustaining Practices, which really is right now very conceptual, and we're really trying to operationalize that and get it into the classroom, and that is part of family engagement. The other piece I'll say is that we now have family engagement as part of the evaluation of headmasters, and I don't want to put headmasters out there. They have a tough job, and I respect them, and I know they're doing the work, but it does have to start at the leadership, and it has to be owned by everyone. So I think it's also an opportunity right now with the many changes that we can actually change the paradigm that family engagement is everybody's responsibility. That's not just the family engagement staff, that every staff person, from the custodian to the para to the headmaster, that everybody really, really owns it. And so I think that we are trying to move in that direction.
So I want to just comment on that and certainly appreciate the work of the district. Monica is the bomb. So very happy to hear about her promotion. That being said, when it comes to student, family, and community engagement, it is certainly about, what time programs are happening, where they're happening, all of that good stuff, but also what we're talking about. And I will tell you that the problems that the district has faced in recent years as it relates to some of the significant, as they're being called, reforms that the district has wanted to put forward, one of the reasons they have been met with fierce pushback has been about what has been communicated and when. And students, families, and community, for whatever reason in the past couple of years, we've had an awakening. People want to be more engaged. We don't want to be told what is going to happen. We want to be part of the process for thinking about solutions, part of the process of implementing solutions, part of the process of success, as well as part of the process of perhaps failure sometimes. If we do not fundamentally change how we go about student, family, and community engagement in a way that leads to greater inclusion of those stakeholders, we will continue to meet the fierce objection that has led us to this point where we're stuck in place. So we really have to be willing to do that. And what that means is sometimes we're not going to hear what we want to hear. Sometimes we're going to have to be in rooms with people we don't particularly care for. We're going to have to hear policy suggestions that we think have been there, done that. But if we are going to move forward, we have to decide that we are all in.
I just want to add to that point, because we had a hearing yesterday on Build BPS, and one of the big, and everyone was there, including Monica, was talking about family engagement, and we all agreed that we have to do better. When you looked at the number of meetings that we had attended and who we engaged with, it was abysmally low. And so we just got our BPS budget. It's going to be coming to the council soon, and more resources were poured into family engagement. But this is where I think I differ with the administration a little bit. which is I think that's something that we need to decentralize. Something in the report talks about how do we take these resources from a central location and possibly put them at the school level. I spent a lot of times with the schools in my district, including the Burke High School in my district, the Frederick, the King, all of these, the Haynes Early Ed, they all speak to the need to have more resources, more human capital within their buildings to do this engagement work, and that they can't do it alone given all that they're dealing with. And so for me, I think these investments, I think we need to have just a deeper conversation about how do we decentralize those a little bit so that those resources go to the school level and not central office. Because I think they'll have a greater impact there. Maybe managed and held and keep them, maintain that sense of accountability for those resources at the school level, at the central office. But I think at some point we have to start to pour more of these resources at the school level.
So I want to get back to, Megan, something you said early on, which was this issue of strategic clarity and vision and priorities. So on the one hand, we should be looking toward the new superintendent to do some of that work, but I also hesitate to put all of that responsibility on one person. But one thing, as I was looking at the report and thinking about the recommendations, I looked back at the last, I think since 2015, and then again in 2016, some pretty comprehensive strategic plans coming out of Boston Public School superintendents. There were 6 priorities with about 10 things underneath each priority. That's true. And so you can't get a lot done when you have so many priorities with a bunch of actions that are related to that. So I would say that something like, to continue the thread on community engagement, would actually need to be part of the vision and values and a key priority. And I want to say something about values as well, because when we think about community and inclusion, that's a value that we would want to have as part of Boston Public Schools, and that should be explicit if it's not already. So I caution that we put all the responsibility on a new superintendent, but I do think that person should definitely leverage some of the work that's already been done, because it's pretty recent, and reduce, though, the number of priorities that will really focus on, again, our students who are most affected by these achievement gaps.
I just wanted to add to that to say that, Boston, one of the oldest school districts in the country, protest is not new. Community dissatisfaction with our school district is not new. With our school leadership is not new. There is deep distrust when you walk through the neighborhoods among parents and community residents who saw a new superintendent being installed and leaving less than 2 years in the job. They're just, people just don't know what to expect. And I think it is incumbent upon the leadership, and getting back to you, Andrea, on the political will in this community to recognize that there is a large bridge to cover when it comes to what the district wants to achieve, what we all want to achieve, which is student success, and getting residents who feel that they're learning about plans in the newspaper, or they're hearing about school closings through a conversation with a neighbor, or they're not being told exactly what is going on, or they've spent, some time getting used to a new superintendent only to see that person gone. And I just think, there's going to be a lot of work in building those bridges. We need to get, if I were suggesting anything, which I'm a reporter and I should not do, but I would say that working to build those bridges would be one of the key things that that's going to, because no matter how good your plan is or your intentions are, if you can't get the parents to buy in, and if you cannot also empower the vast majority of parents who are not white, who are not Asians, who are not in the exam schools, who don't have access to computers and know everything that's going on Twitter, or see the email in the middle of the night, if you cannot get those people on board, we're still going to have the same problem.
So I would like to spend the rest of the day talking about math score and autonomy and partnerships, but we're going to run out of time. So we'll talk about that, I hope, another time, or someone could ask those questions. But I'm going to ask you two more questions. The first one is about your North Star as leaders in the space, as people who think a lot about education and the BPS. So it feels like we're on the cusp of something big. The state is talking about how we fund schools. The search for the new superintendent is underway. I would suggest that the interim superintendent has sown a number of seeds that should yield very positive developments for the district. But the report really did point to this issue that I think some of you have mentioned, which is this coherent, if agile, vision for improvement. And so if you could be bold, if you were in charge of coming up with that vision, what would your North Star be? Without worrying about the immediate constraints, what's your North Star? And anyone can start. And just while you're thinking about that, the next question I'm going to ask is advice for the next superintendent. So, North Star first, then advice.
I will start because it's hard for me to have a North Star vision when I look at how depleted our resources are. So I think that we're facing some drastic things that are going to happen in the future. If we look at the state funding formula again, it is inequitable. It does not meet the needs of urban districts like Boston, who are serving the majority of students that are ELLs, special needs, economically disadvantaged. The city continues to put in large amounts of money. But if we look at in 2010, 20% of the dollars, we received 20% from the state, and next year will be 4%. And to me, that's just, it's an emergency. It's a crisis. And if the governor's bill passes as it is currently proposed, we're really looking at a $12 million shortfall for FY19 and 20. And in the next 2 years, we'll receive $0. So I say this because everybody here in this room has a telephone and has a computer. And so it would be great if you can really get on the phone and start calling your legislators. I'm talking as myself, Alex Oliver Davila, not as a school committee or I'm just a citizen. But if you can really, yes, who votes, who can make some phone calls, shoot some emails, we really need to support the Promise Act, which is going to help us to be able to look at how we actually get funding and to be able to meet those needs. So it's hard for me to have a North Star vision when I look at the depletion of resources. I could say a million things, but just the basics right now, we don't have the resources to meet those basics. And so if we were going to get that money, I have a lot of visions, and I think one of my visions would be that I would love to see families as excited from 6th through 12th grade as they are in elementary school and as engaged as they are. So when we first start, we see families so happy, so engaged, and then it just kind of wanes. And I think there's opportunities around that when we look at the Build BPS. Again, going back to what you said, there's going to have to be some conversations that are not comfortable. We're going to have to make some compromises, and with the understanding that if we want to flourish, if we want to close those achievement gaps, we're going to need to look at some hard things. Looking at facilities, looking at grade configuration. So if I had a North Star vision, I would love it that families would stay and they would be as excited. And my other vision would be that we have some really great packages as a city for young people to stay, that we prioritize BPS Boston residents for jobs, that it's somehow weighted, and that we have, again, businesses lining up to mentor to give jobs, that we have higher education institutions that are providing scholarships or figuring out a way to support students beyond the monetary, that there's more access to those higher education institutions. So those would be my visions if we were to receive the adequate funding that we need.
I just want to add to that. So I agree, the state needs to fix the formula and give us the money that we are due. Give us our charter school reimbursements fully. But I voted no on the council budget, the school budget, I should say. I was the only council to do so because I don't think BPS is a resource problem. We're over $1 billion in the system, and I think I disagree with some folks with respect to that. For me, the question is, what are we doing with the money that we have? And are we spending it wisely, efficiently? So we always use the transportation budget, which was highlighted a little bit in the report. That's $120 million to transport half of the students we serve, under 30,000 students. Counselors who were on the council before I got there usually are sitting next to me and going, it used to be 50,000 students and it cost us $30 million less to transport those students. So what is going on? I think there are many examples of inefficiencies in the system, and I think we need to address that first. And I think if we did that really well, it might be easier for us to get the state to do what they should be doing for the city of Boston. So I just want to put that out there because I have a different way of thinking about that. In terms of the North Star, or whatever the star is, whatever we want to see, one, we need a vision. Yes, and it cannot be informed by one person. It has to be informed by a collective, by the community, proactively. The people in these communities, my biggest neighborhoods are Dorchester and Mattapan. They know what the problems are. They live it every single day. They also know what the solutions are. Right. So the question is, when's the last time we asked them, what do you think we should be doing? And truly bring them in a way that is building trust and acknowledging the distrust based on past behaviors of government, people long before us, even before I was born, the role that government played in building and creating that distrust. We have to acknowledge that and then say, okay, but we still want to engage you. We want you to inform what we're doing. And this vision has to be informed by the community and the residents. We have to do a better job with that. And what should it include? Every student should have access to a quality education from K0 to the 12th grade. And such a good quality education that we don't need charter schools, we won't need parochial schools, private schools, and all the white people that left Boston will come back to our district and say, oh, that school district is so amazing. That's how good the system used to be for many families. And then, of course, we have to tie the school vision, which I alone don't have. I think there are little bright spots that we could take action on, frankly, and this year is all about what are those little things we could do that are specific. But I think this larger vision of having an incredible school system that everyone's like, oh, forget these other schools, I'm going to go here. At the same time, that vision has to be alongside a vision to address poverty, segregation, housing, transportation access, food deserts. The list is long, right, of these inequities that show up in a community, wraparound services. I'm not sitting here at my awesome chief of staff, Ellie, who is a BPS graduate, who's in the front row. Shout out to her. She's a BPS graduate. She's not sitting here just because of the grace of God and schools. We also had mentors. We had good jobs. We had a long careers, right? We had teachers who said, you're going to amount to something, you're going to be somebody. We had teachers that exposed us to Maya Angelou's, right? The people that a whole wraparound approach. And so I think that vision has to be coupled with all these other visions, and they have to work at the same time. And we can't lay it on just the hardworking, dedicated staff at Central Staff, a superintendent, one person. And one thing I'll just add, since we have the media is here, or the media somewhere. The media. We got to start talking about these conversations differently. It can't just be, just negative, ugly. It's depressing. At some point, we have to say, okay, how are you going to talk about these stories in a way that highlights the gems that are happening in the community, frankly, highlights the people in the community at the school level doing really incredible things, and then saying, okay, how do we elevate what they're doing till it's sustainable? How do we share it across other neighborhoods? There are great things happening. I think sometimes the media lens can be really depressing. You want to turn it off, and there's value in having that outlet, that communication to more outlets, and I'm not naming them. Because the Valedictorians Project, the way they shape that with the stories of those graduates was so powerful because it was their voice, right? That was really powerful. You don't always see that, and I think it's a great example of great journalism in a way in which the media could play a better role in helping us shape this vision too.
Thank you, Andrea, for saying that.
You're welcome.
We do a lot of very positive stories about BPS. We just get really hit when we do a lot of the negative stories. But the stories, but we have a big issue. We cannot, put lipstick on the fact that nearly half of BPS students do not finish college within 6 years. We can always focus on the positive things, but that's not the media's job. The media's job is to look at the gaps and the fissures and the fractures and where we can all do better. Yeah, I did spend a year last year looking at, with a team of my fellow reporters, on valedictorians. We interviewed 93 of 113 who graduated from 2005 to 2007. And all we did was just ask them a series of questions. What was your high school like? What did you do after you graduated? Did you go to college? Did you have a mentor? And what we found were some remarkable, amazing young people who came to the United States. Many of them had been refugees. Many of them are immigrants. Many of them had never seen a computer before coming to the United States. They came to the United States, they came as older teens, and somehow they made it to the top of their class. And then they graduated, and then, life happens. And we all have to be thinking about that and how the students are being prepared to take on the world, and whether or not we are doing enough to ensure that the students who live the system are also have the opportunities to take part in the booming economy that's happening here in Boston. I was at an event a couple weeks ago at UMass Boston, and UMass Boston is now adopting the Devers School, or the Devers School. Dever, just now adopting the Devers. Like, this should be happening. Every institution in this city and across this region should have a high school that they've adopted. One of the things that the valedictorians did tell us is when they had coaches and when they had mentors and when they had people in their corner, because most of them did not have, a lot of them did not have, a family that I had. I had a single mom, and my mom was very involved in my life. But not everybody has that. And the mentors serve as a proxy, for lack of a better word. They fill the gap. And the students told us that when they had a support system, they were able to thrive. And I don't understand why more of that is not happening, why we're not, is it okay? Are we satisfied with a place like Northeastern taking just 150 of our kids? Are we satisfied, right, BU giving out, 15 scholarships? These things are the things that we can do now in terms of building relationships and building better opportunities, because we are sending kids out into the world who are not prepared and are totally being blocked from the booming economy that we're seeing right now.
So I have to hit pause because my clock management is terrible, and I've got to invite folks in. But Alex, don't lose that thought. Tanisha, I'm going to come back to you. I would like to just invite one or two questions before we run out of time. Gabby, just make sure you say who you are. And if you could, because we're short on time, just phrase it as a question.
I know. Okay, so I've been burning for a while, so I'm going to try to make it concise. So we were talking about North Stars and getting a vision and all these good things. So what's frustrating, being from the college sector and seeing the end game, I had a history as a career specialist, so I have that understanding of working with high school students and then seeing them hopefully complete some kind of degree, whether it's associates or a bachelor's. So with that being said, if we're talking about North Stars, I think it all starts, and the end game for a lot of our students is finding employment. Not just the ones that are just like nice to have, but one that is gainful employment, that gives them benefits, 401ks, and that type of thing. So instead of talking about colleges adopting schools, why aren't we talking about employers adopting a college and then the college being influenced by employers at the table? So we're talking about enticing employers who have the keys to the kingdom if we're talking about unlocking equity, and having them influence all educators, because educators are part of career development whether we like it or not, and helping them understand how to bring that information to parents so they get excited about investing in an education system and getting diversifying funding, not just through state legislation, but having employers get so excited that they give money. So how do we do that?
I think I didn't hear who that was piping up, but Amanda maybe, and then Alex, if you want to talk about you had mentioned partnerships. I know you remember the Success Boston partnership.
And I actually want to jump in too. I have a reaction to what both Alex and
So we'll go Amanda, Alex, Tanisha.
So I'm glad you raised that, because that was going to be part of my description of a North Star, is that where we have to start is where we want the end game to be for our students. And so I recognize that in this conversation, we didn't talk about the K through 16 potentially, and the essential involvement of industry in helping to craft solutions and to put their money where their mouth is when they say, we want talent, but there needs to be much more investment in a long-term strategy for talent. And that has to be inclusive of our largest population of students, which are Black and brown students. And so there can be better opportunities to create those relationships.
I agree with everything. I agree with what you said, yay. I think that community partnerships, whether it's higher education employers, out of school time, it's a partnership that we need for a 21st century student, and partnerships are crucial to make sure that students are ready. And I just want to go back to your point about the valedictorians is that I agreed with what you said. Part of it is the support piece. So when we look at employers, when we look at higher education, when we look at BPS, out of school time partners, it's how do we all hold the student and family? How do we provide those supports that many of us take for granted that we had them while we were, going through whatever we were going through. And I just want to put in a good word for Success Boston, because I think that is a, relatively small. If you look at it could be much bigger, but it really is working with the college, working with an out-of-school time partner to really provide those supports for students. Because as you said, if they have those, then we're talking about a different success game. But ditto, I don't want to repeat everything you said, but I agree. And that's why I said again about like the Boston residency, prioritizing students, and going back to Counselor's comments about we have to look at other pieces too, because if we can, if we don't have jobs that pay well, how can you afford to live here? So it's also affordability, it's all of these other pieces as well.
Right. And so a couple of things. On the funding, I agree with both Alex and Counselor Campbell. I think it's a both and. I absolutely agree that Boston Public Schools specifically has an inordinate amount of access to an inordinate amount of resources. It's one of the things that was jarring to me when I worked in the district about how we could have so many issues and have so much funding on the table. I agree it's a matter of how we're allocating that funding. I also believe that it has to do with where we are with respect to values. I don't think we're on the same page as it relates to values. So yes, I believe that we have resources. At the same time, I absolutely agree that we need to invest more. And it is an investment. And I do believe that the state needs to step up and do its part. As I've talked to people across this Commonwealth, what is clear is that yes, we all believe, we all value education, and believe that it's not doing nearly enough, and that there needs to be some sort of adjustment to the funding formula. So for me, it is a both and. We need more. We need the state to step up and do more. Boston absolutely needs its fair share. At the same time, Boston needs to wrestle with the reality of not allocating resources in a responsible way that leads to the outcomes that we all want to see. That's one. Two, on my North Star, I actually think it comes down to reframing the conversation. We need a reset and a reframe. We are entirely too polarized on this issue. People are in their corners. Megan, you're absolutely right. Talking past one another, can't hear one another, don't want to see one another, okay? We need a reset and a reframe if we're gonna get this thing right. And that means identifying new ways of communicating. I am tired, every time I hear the word equity, it's like nails on a chalkboard, because I know we're not talking the same language, right? And so I believe that if we are able to reset and reframe this conversation and re-engage with one another to address the issues that are critically important to all of us when it comes to education, that we can then get to a North Star.
And I do just need to make one plug around the budget. The Boston Public Schools this year has developed this very cool data visualization tool that you can find on their website, bostonpublicsschools.org/budget. And you can begin to look to see where the money's going, which I do think the conversation is important. We need to reframe, we need to have it, but starting with a little bit of knowledge about where the money is would be very helpful. Michelle Danubia has a question, and I know it's going to be short because we're going to have a speed round answer. So please introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, I'm Danubia Camargo Silva. I work for the YMCA at Garden Pilot Academy. And Counselor Campbell, I want to just build off of what you said. There's a lot that is happening in the Boston Public Schools that is great work. And some of the Mavericks are just doing it because it's the right thing to do. And GPA is one of 2 community hub schools in Boston, and so is the Burke. So instead of us going into piloting mode, because that's what we do and we want to do new things, look at the work that is happening in Boston, right in Austin, and right on Grove Hall. And leverage of what they're doing. They are community schools. They are bringing the services to the high needs populations that they serve. Before you go into piloting, there are actual pilots. Look at the data, see the impact. When, as you know, educators, they're kind of like a car that needs to change the brake while it's going. And that's how these schools are going.
Oh. We didn't cut the mic, but do you have a question?
Oh. Got cut off, and then my train of thought got cut off. Hang on one second. So my question is, how do we further explore this work and prioritize what they're doing, look at what they're doing, the evidence that they're doing, and how do we support them in improving the areas of improvement that they know, but they just can't do it? How do we look at that so that we can support other schools as well?
I want to give you one example to that, because the Burke High School and Grove Hall in particular, there are a group of principals in the Grove Hall area. They're calling themselves the Grove Hall Alliance. Many folks have gone and seen them in action meet. They've been meeting I've been joining a meeting for the last 2 years, but before that, they were meeting and collaborating before I got there. And I went to a meeting at the Burke, and I was so blown away by 6 women of color who were leading 6 schools in that area when the Dearborn was on top, and their willingness to collaborate and learn, not just from each other, but also from the charter schools in the area, all the schools in the area. And they want to formalize this. And so we've been in different discussions. Superintendent Perel's been there when she was at Edvesters. Many of her team has been there to say, how do you network this school? How do you resource them appropriately, given the fact they're doing this work in Grove Hall? How do you empower them? How do you, and I'm not going to use equity like autonomy, what does it mean? They want to meet the needs of their families. What does that mean for them? They want power over their facilities. So if the community wants to do something at the Burke High School, they don't have to go to central office. They can just make the decision at the school level. They want more control over their money, the budget. They want more control over assignment or different enrollment or other things. They just want more control and power. So I think it's taking that idea and saying, let's take the risk and try something out. If it doesn't work out, we'll tweak it. But one thing that is also important that I've grown to learn through this process is 2 things. One, engaging that community. It has to be co-creation together. And we also have to give them power. Take the power from the school committee, take it from the 5th floor, take it from the council, start to give some of our power to these school leaders, to these teachers in a very formalized way, so they have more, not just on paper authority as a pilot, but actual power to execute those, and I'll put this in quotes, autonomies, because that's a struggle that many of those schools who are pilots or innovation still don't feel like they have the power to actually realize those autonomies.
Tanisha, if you want 30 seconds.
So what I just want to comment on that is I think that this is an example of like where we need to do better. So I learned about what was the good work that's happening in Grove Hall, not from anybody in Boston. Okay? So like we need to bring these things out of the shadows. And it's when we operate in darkness, behind closed doors, behind veils, that trust continues to be broken. And it exacerbates the divide. And so, yes, there's good work happening. However, good work can get stopped dead in its tracks when people don't trust what's happening. And so I appreciate the example and want to offer it as one that we need to do a better job of bringing these things to light and stop operating in shadows.
That is a good story. Yeah. Right.
That's a good story. Come on out, Meg.
I have to step in. We do have to wrap up. I will say I was recently in a training, and one of the comments was we have to learn to accept non-closure. And so I hope you will join me in accepting non-closure today. We hope to continue this conversation. We want to take the report and use it to foster lots of conversations similar to this one. But please join me in thanking this all-star panel.